This is tape April 26, 1990, Karl Hess and Charles Murray. It's the first tape of a series for Karl Hess's autobiography. Okay, we're starting with chapter 1. Tell me about the beginnings. Where were you born?
Washington, D.C., and I've already started writing that. The first paragraph is, I was born on May the 25th, 1923. I was born a cannibal twin. Which is an interesting thing, all described by my mother. But nonetheless, it was true, and I have, as a consequence, 3 sets of teeth some places. And I don't know if there may be other things floating around, but it's apparently not an uncommon phenomenon.
Allow me to read from Karl Hess's The Death of Politics. I'll put a link in the sidebar. Libertarianism is rejected by the modern left, which preaches individualism but practices collectivism. Capitalism is rejected by the modern right, which preaches enterprise but practices protectionism. There is no operating movement in the world today that is based upon a libertarian philosophy. If there were, it would be in the anomalous position of using political power to abolish political power.
Good morning and welcome. In this first hour, I have a very interesting gentleman for you to get to know. His name is Karl Hess. He was, at one time, the chief speechwriter for Barry Goldwater for his 1964 presidential campaign. He also was a principal writer of the Republican National Platforms in 1960 and 64. He was a founding editor of National Review, and now is described by many terms, including anarchist and libertarian of the left. How do you describe yourself? What words would you use?
Well, libertarian's good enough for me, without any directional signs on it. A libertarian's the individualistic variety, as a matter of fact, which also seems to me to mean that I'm a Jeffersonian Democrat, a Taft Republican, a Goldwater Republican. He's a Manchester liberal, however, not a libertarian. I don't know. Labels are very tricky. Dead butterflies require labels, but live people, seems to me they require observation. You look at what they do.
Joining us now is Rick Perlstein, Senior Fellow at the Campaign for America's Future. Rick, thank you so much for coming on the show tonight. So you are a historian of the modern presidency.
Rick, can you tell me what you know about Karl Hess? He was one of Goldwater's key speechwriters, and they were very close. I think they had an enormous affection for each other. And I've always been intrigued by the notion of this person who started out as a right-wing libertarian, became a left-wing libertarian, and he might be someone who could really help us understand what are the flaws and deficiencies in the right's vision of freedom.
Hess ended up shifting his allegiances to the New Left.
Right.
After the blowback from losing the '64 election. What overlap do you identify between Goldwater and the New Left? Hess says that he thinks several New Left activists got their start in Youth for Goldwater organizations.
That's a rich and complicated question. When you're a young person and you feel this longing to adopt liberty and freedom as your North Star, you kind of reach out for anything that's available. And in the early 1960s, the people who were speaking the language of liberty, of freedom, who were speaking with eloquence, who were talking about what later became the New Left themes about the way conformity encroaches on the freedom of the individual, those people happen to be on the right. Let me grab a book, actually. Yeah, this is a really good one. Where is it?
What is it?
That's called The Trap. He gets at a lot of these themes of why the Goldwater right ends up sort of being enemies of liberty. When Barry Goldwater gives his acceptance speech at the 1964 Republican National Convention, he sounds like a guy from the New Left. He sounds like a guy who's speaking in the language of Abbie Hoffman and Tom Hayden. He says, "The tide has been turning against freedom. In our vision of a good and decent future, free and peaceful, there must be room for the liberation of the energy and talent of the individual. Equality, rightly understood, as our founding fathers understood it, leads to liberty and to the emancipation of creative differences. Wrongly understood, as it has been so tragically in our time, it leads to conformity and then to despotism." I mean, the idea that as a conservative you're fighting conformity, first of all, that's a radical idea, and that's an enormous part of Barry Goldwater's appeal. There was no conservative who spoke so effectively in those terms before Barry Goldwater. But let's say you're a person of the right, you want to be an entrepreneur, and yet you can't leave your job because you can't afford to give up your insurance that's achieved through your employer. And you start thinking, well, if Americans were guaranteed health care by the government, that would radically increase the liberty to be an entrepreneur. Well, then you're fighting a contradiction within conservatism, which believes that anything the government does that creates a bigger government is a violation of liberty. That sort of bridge is the one that a lot of people cross between the new right and the new left.
After I got evicted from the Republican Party, I began reading considerably more of the works of American anarchists, thanks largely to Murray Rothbard, who is a right-wing libertarian, I guess you could say. A free market or laissez-faire capitalist is what he is. But he's very familiar with the American anarchists, and I was just amazed. And when I read Emma Goldman, it was as though everything I had hoped that the Republican Party would stand for suddenly came out crystallized in this magnificently clear statement. You immediately see that, consciously or not, she's the source of the best in Ayn Rand.
So I want to talk about what led up to my current state of activism, and I guess you could say I was raised Republican. Both my parents were conservative. My dad listened to Rush Limbaugh and all that. I can remember reading Rush Limbaugh's The Way Things Ought to Be in, I think it was 6th grade, and agreeing with most of what it said. Still do agree with some of it. It's funny, I listen to shit like that now and I wonder how I could have ever thought it was a good idea, but I guess I always liked third parties, but when it came down to it, would generally support the Republican, basically like my parents. So something as evolved as anarchism was never talked about. Distinction between communism and socialism was muddy, very muddy. I left high school not understanding the difference, really.
How you doing?
Pretty good. I'm not quite sure what you're after.
Well, some of it is the curiosity
Okay.
of what you've got.
Well, this whole shelf are all books that Karl has written or that he's in. Like, these are the Fisherman magazine back when he was really young. He used to write, and he was a science writer for Children's Encyclopedia.
Oh, yeah.
Odd things like that. I just wanted to show you just some of the things in here. These were all taken at his memorial service in this book, but there were tons of people. It was just hours and hours, and somebody taped it all. I actually have the videotapes of all of these people who came and talked about Karl. We invited you today. We asked you to come to remember Karl and to celebrate his life. And if you would, I'd like to just have a moment of silence and let everybody sort of think about Karl and say goodbye, say hello, whatever. So let's start that way, please. That'll have to do. If it was a longer message than that, Karl would edit it down because he believed in short sentences and clear statements, and if you can't do it on a postcard, he always said, then it's not worth writing.
This is a letter from my father, Charles Murray. I hereby confess, by way of my daughter Nerissa, that before I met Karl in November of 1989, I had read almost nothing that he had written. It was to cause me great embarrassment. Karl said lavishly nice things about In Pursuit, which I accepted with what I thought was appropriate modesty. Only later did I learn that my modesty was far more appropriate than I had realized, since Karl had been writing the same things, better, for 20 years. But it is not unusual for writers not to be read. My daughter, who is reading this to you, has read almost nothing else that I've written, for example. Perhaps this is the first lesson Karl taught me. If you depend for your life's meaning on the expectation that other people will read what you write, you're in big trouble. Karl taught me by parable and example. The day I remember best, one of those rare days when you know afterwards that the way that you see the world has been importantly affected, was when I took Karl to visit the Antietam battlefield. First we stopped in Shepherdstown to pick up some donuts. I pulled the car up in front of the bakery at a no parking sign. As I was about to turn off the engine, intending to hop out and be back within a few minutes while Karl waited in the car, I could sense Karl's anxiety. Body language, I suppose, but unmistakable. And instantaneously, it was a kind of epiphany. I knew exactly what was the matter. I pulled away down the street towards a legal parking spot, and Karl softly said something about wanting to respect the agreements his neighbors had made. Shepherdstown is not Karl's hometown, and the people who decided to put up the no parking sign were not his neighbors. But the no parking sign was the kind of law that Karl, the anarchist, not only could live with, but insisted on living with. Laws made on a small scale by people who are trying to get along. Can a good libertarian, let alone a good anarchist, come back with a dozen excellent reasons why even small communities are dangerous, given the power of the state? Absolutely. I believe in many of those reasons myself, as did Karl, who advanced them fearlessly when engaged in debate about ideas. But Karl and I were not engaged in debate about ideas that morning. We were buying donuts. It was a lesson in what the cliché that ideas have consequences really means. Ideas do indeed have consequences, not only for things like policy and politics, nor for some mechanistic intellectual catechism, but for our most heartfelt ways of responding to the world around us.
From NBC News in Washington, this is Meet the Press with Tim Russert.
Welcome again to Meet the Press. Our issues this Sunday morning, the most divisive and potentially explosive problem confronting our nation, race in America. Our guest, Democratic Congressman Charles Rangel of New York, and author of the best-selling but controversial book, The Bell Curve, Intelligence and Class Structure in American Life, from the American Enterprise Institute, Charles Murray.
In understanding why it is that Karl Hess went from being a Goldwater Republican and speechwriter to being an anarchist, one of the telling stories is his experience during the campaign of what it's like to be in a limousine in a motorcade. You're going along there, the windows are shut, you can see all the people standing alongside in the street. Here you are in luxury and the little people are out there. And he said this sense of power and of also removal from them, it bothered him big time. And I think that that was for him a kind of symbolism of the ways that government started to repel him when it hadn't before.
Hey guys, I know it's been a while, but I got some stuff in the mail I want to show you. This is an excellent book. Been getting a lot of Karl Hess stuff. This was the last book he wrote, last thing he wrote. It's called Mostly on the Edge. It's an autobiography. He actually wrote 2 autobiographies in his life. I've got the earlier one too. I want to show you a bunch of something he did, a bunch of his interviews with Karl Hess. I ordered this, Dear America. This is used. I think I got all these used. When I got it and opened it up, it's signed by Karl Hess himself. At least what I think. I thought that was really cool. Hi guys. I'm just basically trying to come out. I'm the Argonaut, so whatever. I'd really like to get involved with stuff around here and part of like a bigger transgender community, because it's hard for us. After spending the last 8 months kind of figuring out how to do this and how to become a girl and still not be even close to all the way there. Yeah, we need a lot of help, a lot of support.
This Studs Terkel came to our place, so that was a great day.
Did he interview Karl?
Yeah, he did. He came to the house, we were really laughing at him. He's total klutz. He could not work his own recording equipment, just dropping all over the place. Part of it, I think, was deliberate. Like, it makes you feel equal and and really at home with him. Thank you, there it is. Okay, Karl Hess. We're in Martinsburg, West Virginia. A house he built himself with the help of his wife and 2 sons who did more work than he did on it. He ended up in the hospital twice from doing stupid things like sawing something up there and having it come down and hit him in the head. It was hard for Studs to interview Karl because he was so interested in asking him questions.
and he said the only thing you can't really teach yourself is how to read. And that's how we got involved in literacy, I think, in the first place. But once you know that, then you can teach yourself everything else. You just, you have the tool in one hand and the book in the other. And that's pretty much
but this is something that goes back even beyond that. This goes back to when he gave up school in Washington, D.C. He graduated from junior high, and that was the last of his formal education. And it was all self-learned his whole life.
This letter is from someone who was very close to my father, Bob Kephart. He couldn't be here, but he wrote a letter. Dear Therese, I guess my earliest memory of Karl was just after the calamitous, from Goldwater's perspective, 1964 election. I had recently joined Human Events, and we had extravagant brainstorm that Karl might join us in some capacity, and together we would lead the way in a reconstruction of the conservative right. I set up a meeting with Karl, lunch at a posh downtown Washington hotel, and sat at a table waiting for him. Soon the maitre d'hotel approached with the look of a man bearing very distasteful news. I'm terribly sorry to bother you, sir, but there is a man, and he's saying that he wants to join you for lunch. Perhaps you should come with me, sir. We retreated to the foyer, and there stood Karl, grinning from ear to ear and savoring the irony of the moment. Yesterday's conservative icon, today denied entry into some mecca of conservative decorum because of his attire. Motorcycle, jacket and boots, jeans and work shirt. And my anxieties were only compounded when he insisted that I pile in the back of his motorcycle and go for lunch at a place of his choice, which turned out to be a Cuban restaurant somewhere in the Northwest Corridor. Once we settled down to black beans and rice, I made my pitch to Karl to join Human Events in its plans to engineer a conservative renaissance. Karl listened respectfully, and when I finished, answered in that inimitable sing-song voice that will echo in my memory as long as I breathe, "Well, that's very interesting, but maybe I have a better idea." This better idea, which would burst forth in Playboy 5 years later, is arguably the most influential libertarian manifesto of our time, marked the beginning of the end of my career as a professional conservative. For the next several hours, and ultimately the next several weeks, months and years, Karl patiently acted as my own personal Socrates, forcing me to defend my cherished ideas, ideas which were inevitably to prove undefendable, and leading me, question by question, argument by argument, to conclusions which became inescapable.
Hi guys. Yeah, it's me, Dargonaut. It's pretty much what I've been doing for the past year. Transitioning or becoming a girl. I'll be using my girl channel from now on. I'll put a link, but the videos will probably be on the side because I tagged Dargonaut in them. So yeah, if you want to like follow me or whatever, I still want to talk about anarchism and all that stuff and politics. I'm still interested in the same stuff. Alright guys, well, I miss seeing a lot of you. Hopefully I'll get to talk to you again.
You know, I think it's always relevant. Well, it might be slightly less relevant.
During the time that we thought it was enjoyable,
when they run out of income tax, they're going to come to look at it as well. Well, welcome members. Also, just wanted to mention that this is the 207th meeting of the Karl Hess Club. Well, anyway, let me welcome our guest on the subject of whether conservation in the 21st century, more government or more liberty, Karl Hess IV.
My father, when he dealt with people, he never really judged people or talked to people on the level of ideology. He talked down to the level of things that made a difference to community, He talked about tools and technology, for example. To him, that was really the reality that mattered. In talking about what citizens are doing in conservation today, I like to step back for a moment and talk a little bit about one of my favorite books, and you all know Alexis de Tocqueville, Democracy in America. He talked about these town meetings, these gatherings of citizens making the decisions, forming the local institutions to govern themselves, as being basically laboratories of liberty. To me, conservation represents the resurrection of that concept of laboratories of democracy or laboratories of liberty. Because what we're seeing is an enormous amount of creativity among citizens to solve local problems. And so when we talk about climate change and what's going to happen, sure, at the national level, people are talking about carbon credits. They're talking about taxes on gas and all of this stuff. The micro level where people live and their landscapes, the solutions, if there are going to be solutions to adaptation or even mitigation, however you want to define the problem, it's going to happen through these networks of landowners, networks of groups. Conservation began, its history began in progressive ideology, began in the concept of public service, the public good. And it didn't work out very well. Conservation has devolved to the level of tools today. It's devolved to the level of people doing at the local level the application of tools and local technologies and local knowledge. We've gone from the heavens and we've gone to earth, and frankly, where else does conservation belong but at that level? And so I would be happy to entertain any questions or go into any discussions. I'll go back there. You're the first one, Rachel. My amateur radio friend. What is your call sign? Okay, I'm WF5A.
And then when was the breakup of the USSR? When all of it?
89.
89. Okay, that's when all those countries got interested in anything with the word capitalism in it. And so then that's when we started getting requests for, can we republish your Capitalism for Kids? Mostly they would say, we're like the Libertarians. We learned of this through the Libertarian Party, in Europe or something. Yeah, most of them said, we don't have any money, and I'd say, that's okay, go ahead and do it. Just send me a copy of the book. So then they would send me a copy of the book. And the drawings in it are in English. How to form your own corporation.
And what was the idea with this book in the first place?
To teach kids an awareness of money and economics and earning, and the fact that you can be an entrepreneur at any age. They don't have to wait until they graduate college to start. And you don't have to work for GE. Kind of think for yourself and be creative. So.
Just wondering what you all would think in terms of the ideas or the experiences that Karl advocated for. Like, why would somebody want to revisit them? And I mean, are there things that stand out to you?
For instance, in rural areas today, or even in urban areas, there's this big movement towards local markets and agriculture and food. These ideas of self-sufficiency, I don't think they're so much the individual being self-sufficient, but certainly communities being self-sufficient. And on the other spectrum today, I mean, there are serious people writing about how in modern cities you can actually produce all of your food in cities. Not just your power, but your food.
It seems the same ideas seem to recycle every so often.
Karl has a reputation, and I suppose an image, historically, as being something between a libertarian and an anarchist. And the things that people remember about him are that he lived by barter. Well, he didn't. Karl would laugh and say, you can't live by barter. He thought he could when he first started to try, but he never could. He was an American patriot in the very deep sense of that term, in the original sense of being in love with the vision of a society that Jefferson in particular had. His vision of yeoman farmers and so forth is not that far removed from Karl Hess living out in rural West Virginia as a welder.
For our last segment, we're joined by author and activist Raj Patel, who's just come out with a new book, The Value of Nothing. Welcome, Raj.
So the story of Karl Hess will provide the backbone of my video, but my interests come much more out of trying to understand the left-right overlap around concepts like self-sufficiency and economic localism. You're thinking in The Value of Nothing about how markets need to be understood beyond our current conception of a capitalist market economy is really insightful and is a key to the subjects I'm exploring.
Okay.
So this is an essay by Karl Hess in this book that's called What Are the Specifics? This is the place where he gives his most coherent, clear definition of what he thinks libertarianism is.
I could read it. I mean, as long as you'll be making clear in the film that these are not words that I believe.
I'm totally making it clear.
Libertarianism is a people's movement and a liberation movement. It seeks the sort of open, non-coercive society in which the people, the living, free, distinct people, may voluntarily associate, dissociate, and, as they see fit, participate in the decisions affecting their lives. This means a truly free market in everything from ideas to idiosyncrasies. It means people free collectively to organize the resources of their immediate community or individualistically to organize them. It means the freedom to have a community-based and supported judiciary where wanted, none where not, or private arbitration services where that is seen as most desirable. The same with police, the same with schools, hospitals, factories, farms, laboratories, parks, and pensions. Liberty means the right to shape your own institutions. It opposes the right of those institutions to shape you simply because of accreted power or gerontological status.
Simply because of accreted power or gerontological status. What a lovely paragraph. Basically, if you want to ask me what I believe, I just say what he said. I cannot think of anything in that paragraph that I disagree with.
I dispute quite deeply what Hess is saying. I don't think that the problem is government regulation. I mean, I think that histories of exploitation and alienation are much more important. I certainly am attracted by the idea of people organizing to manage their own resources. I think that's a terrific idea. But to do that without a sort of understanding that there may be other claims on those resources. I'm not cool with people organizing to be able to burn as much oil as they can or burn as much coal as they can just because it happens to be in their backyard. I am much more in tune with ideas of libertarian socialism. I think that is recognizes that the playing field is not level. That you may be born with nothing, and whereas other people will be born with a great deal. And a certain amount of community intervention to make sure that the playing field is level is a good idea. And I don't think that that the kind of libertarianism that he advocates is serious about piercing the idea of private property rights. And I think we need to move beyond private property rights in thinking about the climate and thinking about resources and thinking about land. And there's not enough of that in this idea of libertarianism to make me feel like it's truly like liberty.
One of the things in that paragraph a lot of pure libertarians would bridle at is exactly what does Karl have in mind when he says it leaves people free collectively to organize the resources of their immediate community. Because that implies that if they collectively reach these agreements, they can enforce those agreements. And once you sign on, that you are living in a community which has laws that maybe go beyond the use of force and fraud. You've agreed to pay for taxes to support something that is not in the bare bones libertarian vision. And if I were to try to explain the kind of wavering between individualism and collective action that was part of his philosophy, I guess I'd say that Karl would probably say, look, it actually does get messy.
The final panelist for this evening is Cindy Milstein, who is a part of Occupy Philadelphia. She is the author of Anarchism and Its Aspirations and the forthcoming collective book, Paths Toward Utopia, Explorations in Everyday Anarchism.
Things that I personally, as an anarchist, or that anarchists value, mutual aid or cooperation or self-organization, direct democracy, which is really close to my heart. You can have these values and they work in the testing fairly well, but the value of testing and experimenting when you're doing it with anyone in a community that can wander into a community space, which is exactly the world I want to see, where we can live together in unity with our dissonance and not all be the same but coexist, is being tested out in practice, and it's messy and hard and exhausting and excruciating and wonderful and delirious and joyous. And it doesn't just change the society around us, it changes us. That actual relationship between how much people change at like this accelerated rate while they're trying to change the world they don't like, and when they don't know how to do either, this is this great moment of not knowing. We just don't even know what we're going toward, and it feels utterly enervating and brings us to life because we're suddenly not knowing together, and actually we're doing it, and it's working. And that's what's profound about it. And I think maybe that's why Karl Hess and other figures have spoken so well to people, because they've really said, well, we don't really know it, but look, wow, we actually did create this wonderful thing, and okay, it's not great, so how are we going to try creating it again that looks better?
So you have agreements of your neighbors that you've reached cooperatively, and it may very well be that you will find that you've agreed to something that later you want to get out of. And as an individual, with individual rights, you ought to have every right to do that. That does not mean that you should do so lightly. It doesn't mean that the collective agreement means nothing to you. It is, in practice, a balancing act between your freedom to act as an individual and your loyalty to voluntary collective agreements you've made in the past. And if that means that in talking about these topics on different occasions, you sound like you're coming down on different parts of the spectrum, that I think is a natural consequence of talking about things that in the real world are messy.
Live from Washington, D.C., it's The Larry King Show.
Our guests are David Walter, chairman of the Libertarian Party, and Karl Hess, editor of the Libertarian Party News. How do you define society?
I define society as an agglomeration of individuals, and I never define it as a living, organic reality. Mussolini, his philosophers of the fascist state, made a great deal of saying that there was an organic society, something that existed in reality. I don't see it existing in reality. I see it existing only in terms of numbers of human beings acting occasionally together to accomplish purposes of mutual interest. These purposes are greatly different. If you live in New Hampshire, they're one kind of social purpose. If you live in Alabama, they're different.
It started for me as a sexual thing, and kind of I realized I was, the more time I spent as Candy, the happier I was. And now I really want to seriously do this almost as full-time as I can do it. It helps me get through my life. I'm going through a lot of hard things in my life. I'm going through a divorce, which is really hard. And this helps me kind of get out of that. Kind of helps me be somebody else. But for now, I'm just sticking my nose out and seeing what happens. So, yeah, if you want to talk, go ahead and message me. Yeah. And I'll see where this whole YouTube thing goes. Alright?
May it please Almighty God to add his renowned name to those of Tom Paine, Ben Franklin, Sam and John Adams, Tom Jefferson, and their glorious compatriots in freedom. Ladies and gentlemen, I salute you and this once great country across the centuries, and pray that you graciously receive Mr. Karl Hess, a gentleman and a man of letters who has fought indefatigably for decades to assure that these United States shall achieve their former greatness once more. Thank you.
Thomas Jefferson's ideal for politics was that we would have a republic made up of what he called yeoman farmers. I mean, people who basically earn their own living on their own land. That's an enormously appealing notion to people who think that the government is a force encroaching on people's liberty. Now the question becomes, does the Jeffersonian ideal make any sense in a capitalist country in which 90% of the people make their living working for someone else, in which the supposed Jeffersonian yeomen are CEOs of giant corporations that are more powerful and have more influence over people's lives than a lot of small countries? And whether the whole Jeffersonian notion is just a big dodge for the rise of corporate power, which was unimaginable in Jefferson's time. Something like a joint stock company was just not a part of the economy at all, and in which people's day-to-day lives are constrained by rules that are no less transcendently fixed on the universe than any government regulation. But it's a handy dodge.
Do you have a way to summarize a difference between a sort of right-wing version of local control and a left-wing version of local control?
Yeah, I mean, I think the whole idea of local control myself is pretty romantic. I mean, I think that ship has passed, and we live in an interconnected world in which large-scale organizations are required just to produce and manage the world we live in. I mean, in a sense, if you're a libertarian pining for local control, it's a kind of you're kind of a beautiful loser, and there's very little place for you in the practical world. By the way I see it, right-wingers, the further down you get into their actual mode of political organization, believe in hierarchy, believe in authority. Whether that authority is vested in a church or a family, a patriarchal family, even in a government in the case of a fascist state, or a corporation in the way that right-wing ideology works these days. Left-wingers have a much more robust sense of the possibility of non-hierarchy, often in both cases honored in the breach. Ideology is the most complex thing in the world. It's our attempt to kind of give names to forces, dispositions, which often are just so complex and unnameable. And we're all struggling. We're all at sea to kind of give names for our dispositions. And we often talk past each other. But, God love those who try,
Who got the money? They got the money. They got the money. We got the bill. Who got the money? They got the money. They got the money. We got the bill. Who got the money? They got the money. They got the money. We got the bill. Who got the money? They got the money. They got the money. We got the bill. Banks got sold out. We got sold out. We got sold out. We got sold out. Banks got bailed out. We got sold out. Banks got bailed out. We got sold out.
The idea for having the roast came to me while I was in the county prison that was pretty rough. I suggested to friends of mine that it's about time that we honor Karl. We don't know how much longer we were going to have him, and that we should also recognize our ideas, since it was about the time of the events going on in Eastern Europe.
Well, I've spied on Karl for about 20 years. I would say that Karl's principal contribution is that he showed how classical liberals, objectivists, could be part of the 60s. Now, we thought that Rand was heroic, and that Rand had some big ideas about fighting authority. And then we learned about people like Ken Kesey, Tom Robbins, Robert Heinlein. And then we found out about the balladeers that were writing the songs of freedom at that time. People like The Who, The Beatles, Steppenwolf, Bob Dylan. And all of this helped us become like this dialectic between free market capitalism and the cultural type of anarchism that was developing at that time. And who was responsible to a great deal for introducing us to this was Karl Hess, and for example, in the Death of Politics article. But probably most importantly, Karl introduced us to this by being Karl. I mean, Karl was involved in the anti-war movement. He was involved with SCS. He was involved in inner-city organizing, for example, in his neighborhood research and development group. He was involved in actually developing ecological alternatives. And I guess in a way, it could make us kind of suspicious of him. I mean, he's not really like other libertarians. I mean, mostly, you know, we sit around and theorize. Karl goes out and actually does something. Now, as someone who's known for exposing spies, I think it is time that we expose this Trojan teddy bear once and for all. I mean, how many of us, if it wasn't for Karl, might have become, let's say, a Republican speechwriter or somehow influential? I mean, just think of it. All that power and prestige just for making Reagan and Bush look clever. God, can you imagine the drugs they would give you just to do that? Or the drugs that you would need just to do that? But no, due to his influence, we chose truth. We chose principle over politics and money. And in so choosing, we got something else in the bargain. The delight of knowing one of the warmest and wisest men of our generation, Karl Hess.
You know, from the little that I have read about you, one might say that a guy who once worked for Barry Goldwater and then in the same lifetime was involved with the Black Panthers had undergone some sort of very strange conversion. From the outside, that would look like a very
I know, it does look strange. I'm not too sure. As a matter of fact, my attitudes or ideas have changed very much. Well, for instance, I worked with the Black Panthers because of all the black organizations. They struck me as being most like the kind of Republican I had been. They were for local politics rather than national politics. They weren't asking for help, they were asking for freedom.
People often forget that the Black Panther Party was also a service organization in many ways. There were over 40 survival programs that ranged from providing free shoes to escorting elderly people home at night to school breakfast programs. At one point, the Black Panthers were feeding more kids than the state of California was. This was a problem for the federal government and particularly for J. Edgar Hoover, who saw nothing more dangerous than black people who were winning over the sympathies of the middle class by doing things like feeding kids. But what I'm keen not to be lost is the lesson here. If one is interested in building a movement for social justice and social change, then food is definitely a part of that. On the flip side, food can't be the only thing that you do, and the Black Panthers realized that right off the bat. I like that Black Panther story because it's a way of reminding us that in the food justice world, we have an ideological pantry that's rarely raided. We've kind of left these ideas on the shelf for a long time because of the way that the food movement, in some ways, has come from a middle class trajectory. But there's always been a radical food movement in the United States.
Incidentally, the cameraman in this project is Charles Murray. But here's my message. Although I'm not there, I am here, which all things considered is a good deal better than where I would be, were it not for the ability of surgeons to replace substantial parts of my plumbing. My metal and silicone heart valve clicks merrily along. The Gore-Tex tube with which my burst aorta was resealed, seems to be holding its own, so that I can claim at least partial bionic status in this wonderful world in which we live. Tools and the ideas associated with them always have been the signposts of human enterprise, no matter what the history books say. The history books, most of them regard the 1660s as a time of major treaty making, a golden age of diplomacy. But in that same decade, Newton invented differential calculus. Well, how many treaties have ever changed the world as significantly as has calculus? Treaties change the relationships between government officials. They are fleeting and unstable. Calculus made possible much of the machinery and much of the industrial processing of our entire age. My favorite example of this kind of thinking is 1962. In that year, the United States established a military mission in Vietnam. In the same year, Crick, Wilson, and Watson got their Nobel Prize for describing the molecular structure of DNA. Of course, Vietnam killed many people, and certainly distorted the political life of most of us. But its lessons slip every day farther from political discussion or even consciousness. By contrast, we can look to genetic engineering for an entire era of better lives for humans everywhere. We used to be called unique among living creatures because we used tools. Our unique role, it seems to me, is that we create tools. If tools are available, humans will use them. If they are not available, humans will create them. Hooray for the goddess. Hooray for all of our friendships. Hooray for life and for the world and for human intelligence. That is the only game in town. You look very steady.
Well, but it's hard for me to tell how much the wiggling's going to.
So I wanted to kind of make a video to update people, especially people who knew me before, about kind of my fluctuating and evolving politics. And I suppose I should kind of start where I began. I was cruising around one day on a BitTorrent site and came across this documentary called Manufacturing Consent. And I downloaded it, and it changed my life, blah blah blah. Had this epiphany. Okay, this is it right here. Right after that, I downloaded this other documentary called Anarchism in America, and rather than really getting hardcore into Chomsky, I kind of got more into Karl Hess and Murray Bookchin, and this book right here. Yes, read this book. Kind of went through this evolution. I was an anarcho-capitalist, and then moved a lot more towards like sort of fusing, you know, like not only agorist, but like leaning even a little more towards like primitivism, which oddly enough is almost where I'm back at. It was within the first week of going full-time that all these things clicked in my head. A lot of the things that I had heard for many years from the, you know, from the lefty anarchists, from the red anarchists, started to ring a lot truer to me. Within the first week, I understood feminism. I understood, you know, exploited classes. I understood privilege. And being a trans person, I'm really like squarely on the left. There's not much I can do on anywhere else, because, you know, that's where, you know, GLBT people belong, and that's where everyone thinks GLBT people belong. And like, you know, being trans, it's on my sleeve. You know, there's nothing I can do to hide it. I mean, you see me, you hear my voice. I'm not the most passable person in the world. I mean, maybe you think I am, but I'm not. People who aren't on the left, it very much have, you know, like, kind of an aversion to me, and I can feel it, I can sense it when I meet someone. I should wrap this up. I'm going to continue this in another video.
There were people from right and left all over the place, from the Institute for Policy Studies, and then from the Libertarians, and it was different worlds. I mean, it was our hometown people, too, our neighbors. The farmers, they came. Dolores stood up and talked because she said Karl was like a real dad to her. She always called us Mom and Dad. These were some people from my literacy program even that came out. Karl was a tutor in my program, too. I tried to get him to to get a GED along with the student that he taught to read, but he wouldn't do it. He thought about it. I thought it would be such a cool story for the tutor and the student to get them together, and he thought it would be a cool story too, and that almost was enough to make him do it. And then he decided no, he was way too proud of the fact that he never had a high school diploma, so he wouldn't do it. When Karl and I got married, it was sort of an affair like this. I think maybe there weren't quite as many people there, and he was in a lot of trouble in those days. He had recently become a tax resister, and he was working with the Black Panthers, and he was looked at, I think, with some question, probably both from the left and the right. He was just new at the Institute for Policy Studies and came from a Republican side of things, so I think they looked at him a little askance. I know he was followed by a couple of agents from various federal agencies, and I was new to all this. I was just a sort of a naive young person out of college and had never been political, and this all scared me a good bit. And when Karl thought we should get married, I was kind of scared. I thought that within weeks, months, or certainly a couple of years, Karl would either be jailed or would be in some foreign country someplace hiding out. I actually sent him away at one point and said, I can't do this. And I remember in 1970, I was going to the beach to spend Thanksgiving with some friends and had my epiphany on the way there. It was like a lightning bolt. It just occurred to me that this is a man that is really worth risking everything for. So as soon as I got back to Washington, I called Karl and told him that, and he came right over, and we've never been apart since. And after all the talks about my being afraid and how our life would be together, Karl wrote a wedding song, and I thought that I would read that to you today. And I hope I'll get through this. I hope you understand if I don't. It's very repetitive because there's a refrain that comes after every verse, and it's very rhymey, which, you know, is maybe not good poetry sometimes. But keep in mind that it is a song and not a poem, and then it should all be all right. There is no way to own the sky, and yet we fly, and yet we fly. Fish in the water all around the ocean, yet there's a shore on the edge of the motion. Moving round, moving up, moving down. Put your feet down on the ground, and if you've a mind to, let's walk together. Let's walk there together. There is no way to own the day, yet for every flower there's a sunny ray. Grain and vines all over the land, yet there's a place for a forest stand. Moving round, moving up, moving down. Put your feet down on the ground, and if you've a mind to, let's walk together. Let's walk there together. There is no one who owns another, sister, brother, kin, or lover. Yet there's sharing, yet there's caring, yet there's calling, and yet there's hearing. Moving round, moving up and moving down. Put your feet down on the ground, and if you've a mind to, let's walk together. Let's walk there together. We'll go and we'll see together. Together we'll go and we'll see. And so that was the beginning, and I hope all of you maybe have some stories or whatever that you want to share, and we'll just sort of take turns. And it's just fine with me if we spend the next 6 hours here. I'll be just happy listening to everybody talk.